Hello, welcome back to the Conflict Skills Podcast. I'm your host, professional mediator Simon Good. In today's episode of the podcast, I'm going to be talking about how to navigate cultural differences and conflict, particularly in a workplace setting. In this podcast, I provide free tools and resources for dealing with conflict, so if this sounds like the kind of topic that's useful for you, and you would be interested in additional resources around common kinds of situations that people find challenging in dealing with conflict, then please consider pressing subscribe. And if what I talk about today is useful for you, I would be incredibly grateful if you could give a positive review. So I worked overseas for a couple of years at an early stage in my career. I'd worked in a number of different not-for-profits in Australia, and then my wife and I got married, and so we decided to go and live overseas in South Korea for, initially it was going to be 12 months, but we ended up extending it for 2 years. And I've been back and forth to Korea a couple of times in different study and work-related roles. But I can still remember the boss of the school that I worked in first. Her name was Julia. She was probably in her mid-40s, this very intimidating, confronting, assertive Korean manager. Very loud, very direct. She wore a lot of makeup and jewelry and business-like type of clothes. You know, if you Google like power women dressing in an office, that would be the kind of thing that she would be wearing, like the big shoulder pads and the high hair and the big high heels. And so even for me coming as a foreigner, I interpreted all of these non-verbal, I guess, communication cues that she was sending in this particular way. Like she spoke in a loud volume. And so if I had a boss that talked to me like that, or that interrupted me when I was in the middle of talking, for example, or started a meeting just by talking themselves for 10 minutes rather than inviting participation from the other staff members who are present, like I interpret that in a particular way, which might be that they're very arrogant or a bit narcissistic or self-important or whatever. And of course, this is really just an example of cultural difference. And so one of the reasons I think that I got offered the job as the head teacher of the school after that first year, which was part of the reason why we decided to stay. And I think part of that is because I was good at navigating some of these, I guess, gaps in our cultural expectations around what both of us think should happen and what's appropriate professional communication and all the rest of it. It was an interesting kind of context to work in because we had around half of the staff group, so maybe 15 people or so, were Korean staff. And then there was 12 or 15 foreign teachers that were the teaching staff. So I was the head teacher, sort of responsible for almost like a team leader kind of role or a line manager, responsible for overseeing the work of the foreign teachers. And they all had a 12-month contract that they were usually in. So it was kind of like a revolving door of team members that I was working with. And then the Korean staff were often there for a lot longer, you know, often 5 or 10 years. And they reported directly to the Korean manager, Julia. And I can remember the biggest example of cultural differences and conflict that I came across was Thomas, who was a teacher that worked with the team. I really liked Thomas. He was from America. He was good-hearted, really funny, you know, quite a sarcastic, cheeky kind of person, which probably similar to me. We I think resonated and got off okay in terms of our working relationship, but pretty early on there was a number of complaints from students that he was teaching. Their parents were complaining, to be more specific. And Thomas, I think, had a number of different cultural differences just in the way that he was that Koreans probably found quite confronting. He was overweight and a big kind of guy. He dressed in a, you know, it's sort of like 90s hip-hop, like the big baggy pants or 2000s like skating culture kind of thing. Like, I guess that's what you could describe it as, like punk rock or skate kind of clothes. So he had piercings and tattoos and he spiked his hair up and this kind of stuff. And Koreans interpret all of this in a different way. I know some parents made comments like, he looks like he's part of a gang. Now, having a tattoo in Korea has particular kinds of connotations, and a lot of the time it is gang members who had tattoos. This was back when I did it, which was probably 15 years ago now. I think things have probably modernized and that's become a little bit more of a cultural norm, but back then it was more of a homogenous expectation that if you had tattoos, this was a what would you say, like a defiant kind of action that you could take. Whereas in America, having tattoos was something that was far more common, and to be honest, it probably wouldn't factor into a lot of hiring decisions or the way that parents were perceiving their teacher. If you have a teacher who has a tattoo, you might not necessarily think that there's a problem, but in Korea, it was a problem. So we had Julia, who was my boss, getting a complaint from one of Thomas's students' parents, and then she would go and talk to Thomas about it. And I can remember one day I was sitting there doing some prep for my class, and I could hear clip, clop, clip, clop, clip, clop coming up the hallway, a little bit like the Billy Goat's gruff, clip, clop, clip, clop, the big goats coming across the bridge. But these were Julia's 3 or 4 inch high heels clipping up the hallway. And I could hear her literally yelling, "Thomas, Thomas!" And she couldn't find him. And so I heard clip, clop, clip, clop, clip, clop up a few different sections of hallway. And then the clip clopping noise gradually became louder, and I realized that she was coming for me. And I heard the cry, "Simon, Simon," which was how a lot of the Koreans pronounce Simon, because they don't have that equivalent vowel sound in their language. So my name gets an extra syllable and I become Simon. And whenever there was a problem, I seemed to get that extra syllable a lot more distinctly. "Simon, where are you?" So Julia clip-clopped up to my office, yelling Simon even from literally like 5 centimeters outside my door. So I'm sitting there looking at my doorway, expecting her to appear, probably with a look on my face that was a little bit like, "Are you serious? Like, this is how you talk to another adult, let alone a staff member? Like, how on earth does this seem respectful for you?" Anyway, she sort of strolled into my office very casually, interrupting me, even though I wasn't in the middle of something because I heard her coming, but she didn't know that necessarily. And then she immediately said, "Where is Thomas?" And I'm like, "Hi, Julia, how are you?" "I don't know. Is there something that I can help with?" And she said, "I want to find him and blame him." And I can remember, I think, just feeling this complete sense of incredulity, if that's a word, that this is how you would talk to your staff members. Like, honestly, if my boss talked to me like this, I would give them the middle finger, swear at them to their face, and probably quit on the spot. So she was lucky that she did tend to treat me in a little bit more of a respectful kind of way. I think probably early on she learnt that she couldn't push me around in the same way that unfortunately she felt like she could push Thomas. But here I was stuck in the middle of these 2 very different cultural expectations. Julia from Korea has this very top-down leadership style, very directive, very abrupt, and doesn't mind things like being abrasive. So she would give negative feedback very directly, not caring about his feelings, for example. Then we've got Thomas, this teacher, and from my perspective, of course, I can empathize with his experience. He's traveled halfway around the globe to this country that he doesn't know. He's probably going through all sorts of cultural shock and probably loneliness and feeling a bit homesick. And I'm sure that he's aware that there's issues with his classes, at least on some level. So for him, getting feedback around a complaint that a parent has made about his students, like, that is a situation where I at least would be treading really carefully and wanting to take a supportive kind of angle, even if that's what I think is just because that's what I think is going to get the best outcome from him, It's not just that I'm this caring, loving kind of person. I think that if we come across it in too much of an adversarial way, then we've got no chance of getting buy-in, of him actually improving or changing. But for her, that's not something that even crosses her radar. Julia, in her office, she worked in the same open plan office as the rest of the Korean staff, and she would sit up the very back of the classroom, and not the classroom, the office, but it felt like a classroom, and all of her staff would be in front of her with their monitors positioned so that she could see what they were doing at any particular moment in the day. And they stayed back to work really late. Like, the classes that we were teaching would finish at around, I think it was 9:30 p.m. or something. Koreans really go pretty hard in terms of education. So this was like an English academy. So these poor kids, especially high school kids, would have spent all day in school. Then they would have gone to, piano academy or violin academy or something, and probably maths academy and science academy and everything. And now they're showing up to English academy, sometimes at like 7 p.m. and I would teach them until nearly 10 p.m. And they've been learning since 9 a.m. and they've probably still been given homework to do before the next day kind of thing. So even for me as a staff member, I was just frazzled and fried by the end of the day. I just wanted to get home or probably more specifically get to the pub with the rest of the foreign teachers, knowing that we didn't have to start work until the next afternoon. But these poor Korean staff would stay much later than that. They would often be there at 11 p.m., sometimes even later. And I can remember saying to some of them, like, what's going on? Are you so busy? Why don't they just employ a few more people? Wages at the time weren't that high, to be honest. So to me, it was like, just hire another staff member to be an assistant for you all. That would make sense. But they said it's not that it's too busy. We finished our work hours ago most days. The cultural expectation in Korea was that you couldn't go home until your boss went home. And so they were staying there kind of doing busy work because she could see their screen, so they couldn't look at Facebook or anything. So they were just kind of doing data entry or something that didn't really need to be done until the boss finally picked up her handbag and stood up and got the jacket and said, all right, let's go. And then that was kind of the informal cue to everybody else that they could go home as well. So this is the environment that we're operating in. And for me, I found this incredibly challenging, trying to navigate between these two different cultural norms. For me, it was about almost like becoming a translator, and I needed to figure out exactly what Julia meant, which had a number of different components. It was like, what are the facts that she's talking about? But then also her interests, what does she actually want? And then the final step was like, what are her expectations moving forward? Like, how flexible is she willing to be? Does she just want Thomas to be aware that there's an issue, or is she looking for some kind of a plan, or, that kind of thing, which is what I would be looking for myself. Thomas, on the other hand, he wanted to know very clearly what was going to happen moving forward. Like, does this mean I'm going to be going home to my home country and all of a sudden I'm going to find myself with a plane ticket in my hand and getting told that I've been fired? He wanted to know specifically around what the issue was to resolve it. So for him, it was very much this solution-focused, problem-focused kind of aspect on one level. But then, of course, there was the emotional impact of worrying that everyone's complaining about you and talking about you behind your back and all the normal kinds of human stuff that would come up in that kind of situation. So I think this is a good example because it helps to illustrate some of the way that these cultural differences play out in practice. And for you, when you're talking about cultural differences at work, it's likely that there are specific behaviors that come to mind. A lot of the time, it starts with differences in expectations. This could be very practical, pragmatic things like being on time, for example, but I often drill down even further. It's things like, is it appropriate or rude to be 5 minutes late for a meeting? Is it appropriate or rude to look at your phone during a meeting? When your boss calls you and you have a missed call but there's no voicemail, do you call them back? When your boss writes you an email and you have to get back to them about something, what's the accepted amount of time to get back to them? Or if you have a conversation with someone, should you follow up and put it in writing? These are all kind of situations or forums where there can be so many different interpretations and almost like reasons for different expectations to be given. And the truth is that a lot of us have far more of a fluid or flexible set of expectations around these things than we think. If it's our friend, then we probably don't mind if they're 5 minutes late. Whereas if it's someone who's made a formal complaint against us and we're just sick of them and we feel like they're almost an enemy, then we're far more likely to think that being late is this incredible wrong that they've done to us and like find a way to stand up for ourselves and be assertive. And so we ourselves probably have a much higher level of subjectivity that we bring to these expectations. And particularly when we're dealing with conflict around some of this stuff, the starting point often is to start from a place that's very open. Look, it makes sense that we would have different ideas around this. You probably have different background to me, different experiences in previous jobs that you've worked in, even different things that work for you, whereas I might operate in a different way. So the starting point should be an assumption that you've probably got a difference, at least at some level. And so you will need to find a way to navigate that moving forward, which means that as you discuss expectations, it's often a much more flexible arrangement that you come up with versus just, this is how we do things here, take it or leave it, it's my way or the highway type of approach, which tends, even if the person does say yes to our face, we might find that either they don't do it, or like a child who feels like their parent is being a bit unfair in the punishment, they might find a way to get back at us in some way down the track as well. It's one of the benefits, I think, of communicating to people in an adult to adult kind of way. When you become more like the parent of, this is what's appropriate, children, this is the punishment if you don't do the right thing. And you see so many organizations taking on that parental role of, it's almost like, what's the word, infantilizing people? Like, you treat your staff like children. Well, you shouldn't be surprised then when they have the moments of throwing all of the toys out of the cot. There might also be specific cultural differences that come up when there's a problem. So the catalyst or the trigger for the conflict might be something practical, like a shortage in the materials, or something's going to take longer than was expected, or a client has changed what they want, and so we're dealing with a situation where there's a bit of scope creep or something like that. Or maybe there's restructure happening within an organization, and although things had previously gone pretty well just because everybody knew what was expected, all of a sudden, because there's a higher level of uncertainty, it's kind of turned up the heat on some of the issues that you were dealing with within the team. So there could be issues that are going on or problems, and I think this often shows a lot of cultural difference in practice. For example, when someone makes a mistake, in some cultures, the norm is that you would kind of sweep it under the rug, whereas in other cultures, there's an expectation of transparency. Look, you can come to me for support, but I need you to come to me when there's an issue. I want to be aware of what's going on. Whereas in other cultures, it's much more like each person is expected to figure it out as they go. And if there's a problem and you talk to your boss about it, the most likely response is punishment. To be honest, I think if I came and talked to Julia about a problem most of the time, I would be expecting that that was going to create extra work for myself. And so it wasn't surprising that a lot of staff weren't very transparent and honest with Julia. Leadership style is another classic example though, and this might be things like the distance, like Australia has a very flat leadership hierarchy, for example. So we tend to be able to go and have a beer with our boss or put up our hand in a meeting and say, actually, I think there's a problem with this, or you might have forgotten this. So leadership style could be stuff like power distance, how familiar you can be with your boss, how much input they expect. It could be things like that collaborative leadership style versus top-down. It might be in communication. Some people prefer a much more indirect or roundabout way of communicating. Other people would do that more directly. There would be particular leadership styles that tend to focus on the group, so communicating things to the team or running team meetings as a group. Other leadership styles prefer more of a one-on-one approach and more of a nuanced, flexible, detail-oriented way of dividing tasks and work-related responsibilities. And all of these things, there's no right and wrong, but you'll notice that a lot of the cultural differences and conflict that comes up as a result is simply a factor of these different leadership styles, which often, again, results in different expectations. And so the way to navigate some of this is, as much as possible, to clarify expectations, to take that same open approach of course, there will be differences here. We just need to find a way to navigate this moving forward. And an assumption, of course, that won't be a single process of this is the plan, tick, we're all done, we've solved this now. It's more about building in a process that won't stop, it's ongoing, of the two of you finding a way to communicate about what's working and what's not, and then finding a way to tweak what's needed. So if we were to sort of summarize that then in terms of what strategies tend to work, it would be avoiding assumptions, to always go back and check, is that true? Am I sure that it's true? And that often involves drilling down to the data or behavior, like what's actually happened here? What did they actually say? I think that they meant this when they said this, but I'm not 100% sure. So then my starting point would be to clarify it. It sounds like this is what you meant by that, or when you said that, this is what I took it to mean. Have I got that right? It's this inherent slowing down, going back to that fine level of detail and approaching a problem from this very open way that I don't necessarily know everything. I don't necessarily need to figure out what's needed at the moment, at least. This is something that we can collaborate on and we can leave open-ended and flexible to some extent moving forward. So this would be a constant process of reviewing. And as I approach a review, whether it's me thinking about a relationship I have with a staff member who's got a different cultural background to myself, for example, or even as I work with them and I'm talking to them about how things are within the team and, how are things going? Is there anything that would help if we could think about making it different, etc. I'm really doing that from this way that It's not so much right and wrong, I've solved it or I haven't, there was a problem and now there isn't. It's more of an acknowledgement that let's work together to continually improve. And so what we need to focus on then in that case is the reciprocal patterns that are involved. That might be me, what I do when, I feel like there's an issue and I need to raise it with the other person, or they've come to me and raised an issue. So I could think about how I manage Julia, when she's clip-clopping up the hallway. Maybe I can think about taking a few deep breaths so that when she comes in the door, I've got a little bit more leeway before I react and get upset when she is being quite rude. Or maybe I could think about a way to talk about this with her, but when there's not a pressing issue at hand, which would mean that she's not escalated up to that 7 out of 10 level of stress. If she's just got a complaint from a parent, of course, that would be stressful for her. So this probably isn't the time for me to talk to her about treating the foreign staff with respect. If I do decide to do that and sort of talk with her about it, and I did do that, and we did figure a lot of it out, but I needed to do it in a way that was quite strategically set up. So I chose a time and place where she wasn't stressed. She wasn't running from this meeting into the next one. It was just her and I. I decided that would be a better way to talk about it rather than with the other staff there. I didn't let her know what I wanted to talk about ahead of time because I think that she often had a very adversarial type of direct approach. Like if I said, I want to talk to you about this issue, she usually tried to convince me why I was wrong even before I'd said what I thought should happen. So I learnt that I really needed to raise problems or issues in a way that was extremely neutral. Like I'm sure you might have noticed this, and of course part of the challenge is foreign teachers just don't know how things work in Korea. So we need to find a way to give them the right information that would set them up for success. And part of that is going to be how you communicate with them. Here are some ideas I've got, and you might have some other ideas that you think would work. Would that be okay if we talk through some of this stuff? So I really needed to be very careful not to say to her, I think this should happen. And particularly, I could never say, you're doing this is causing a problem. I really needed to name the dynamic, and that was that reciprocal pattern. When you've talked to Thomas about this issue, this is the response that he's had. That's not what you were hoping for. Like he hasn't changed, the problem hasn't gone away. So let's think about a different way of coming at this problem, because I'm aware of the significance that it has. We can sort of, if you're dealing with a different kind of boss or a different kind of organization, you could do this much more formally, like writing an email or having an agenda or inviting a senior manager in to be part of it, etc. Or you might do it much less formally. Like if you're a builder, you might just, during smoko when you're having a coffee, just have an aside conversation with the guy that you're working with, rather than setting up a meeting and doing it in that more formal kind of way. It really is horses for courses, but the same approach tends to work best, which is avoiding those assumptions, looking for clarity, and looking at the reciprocal patterns that are going on, which then often opens up the options and we can come up with ideas. And then it's that flexible process of experimenting. Is this better or worse? Maybe I've put something in place that's actually caused a number of other headaches or dramas or issues that I didn't anticipate. And so now I've got extra hassles to deal with. But through this gradual process of experimentation, you will start to find approaches and strategies and ways of responding that works for you. And then that starts to create momentum. As you become more confident, you become more capable at dealing with conflict, then the next situation that you're in doesn't tend to rattle you as much. You can approach it with more of your rational brain switched on rather than going into the survival brain, fight or flight, panic mode, where we lose a little bit of focus and we have trouble coming up with the right words and all the rest of it. And so then you'll get a better response from the other person that you're dealing with, and you'll find that there's more and more airtime, more and more leeway, more and more oxygen available to focus on the tasks and the relationships and to spend your time doing more of the things that matter and less getting stuck and dug down in all of the stickiness and the stress and the challenges of navigating some of these cultural differences. So I hope that has been helpful for you, thinking about some of the ways that I think about cultural difference, particularly as a mediator, but even when I'm doing conflict coaching, it's a pretty common situation that comes up. If you've got feedback about the podcast, you can shoot me an email. It's podcast@simongood.com. Again, if it's been helpful for you, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd be willing to leave a positive review. Otherwise, all the best navigating the conflict situations that you're dealing with over the next week or two. Bye for now.